Meteorologists have long maintained that the sudden condensation of atmospheric moisture requires a specific drop in temperature or a rise in humidity. They are mistaken. What occurred in the heart of Manhattan was not a weather phenomenon, but a biological demand. The air did not cool, it surrendered. In the center of Times Square, the vacuum of space seemed to manifest for a fraction of a second. The instantaneous displacement of 400 kilopascals of atmospheric pressure struck the pavement. With the force of a falling anvil, there was no flash of light. There was no soup flare. There was only the sudden, heavy presence of something that had never asked for permission to exist. YUJIRO HANMA stood amidst the fractured geometry of the concrete. The crystalline fracture of the floor tiles had exceeded their structural load-bearing limit in 0.003 seconds. It created a spiderweb of pulverized stone that radiated exactly 1.5 meters from his heels. He did not look like a man who had traveled between worlds. He looked like a man who had simply found a new room to occupy. The ogre stood with a stillness that was predatory. To the tourists and the office workers, the world had suddenly become very small. Their brains, wired by millions of years of evolution to detect the scent of a lurking leopard, began to misfire. Cortisol levels spiked so violently that the metallic tang of blood filled the mouths of bystanders. Their muscles weakened, their knees buckled, not out of reverence, but because their nervous systems were attempting to play dead. Yujiro took a breath. It was a long, legato draw of oxygen that seemed to pull the very spirit out of the surrounding neon. He tasted it, the chemical artificiality of the air. He smelled the blue-hued sludge pumping through the veins of the city, a manufactured strength that lacked the grit of the mountains or the sorrow of the trenches. It was the scent of a shortcut. High above, a digital screen displayed the seven, their capes billowing in a simulated wind. Yujiro's eyes, burning with the embers of 1,000 conquered battlefields, drifted upward. He saw the golden-haired hero with the plastic smile, the gaze of a man who had never felt his own ribs crack under the weight of a superior force. A heavy silence, thick as cooling tar, settled over the square. The only sound permitted to exist was the rhythmic, slow pulse of the ogre's jugular. He began to move. He did not navigate the frantic throng. He simply stepped forward. Each footfall was a staccato percussion that resonated in the marrow of the witnesses. The crowd did not move because of a conscious choice. They were repelled by the sheer, unadulterated density of his presence, like magnets of the same pole, being forced apart. The king had arrived in a land of actors, and he was hungry. Sociologists specializing in urban panic have long posited that the human fight or flight response is a binary mechanism triggered by a recognizable threat. They are fundamentally incorrect. In the presence of a true biological anomaly, the brain enters a third state, the biological surrender. Yujiro Hanma pushed open the heavy oak door of a dive bar, 3 blocks removed from the neon chaos of the square. The hinges, rated for 10,000 cycles of standard operation, did not merely creak. The internal pins sheared under the casual application of his torque. The door hung at a precise 87-degree angle. Defeated. The air inside, a stagnant soup of cheap hops and desperation, immediately rushed toward the exit. It was displaced by the sheer mass of the ogre's entry. The dim lighting of the establishment seemed to retreat. It was not a trick of the optics. It was a physiological phenomenon, known as peripheral tunneling. Every patron in the room experienced a sudden contraction of their visual field. Their brains prioritized the 190-centimeter tall wall of scarred, bronzed muscle now standing at the threshold. He walked to the bar. His gait was a mathematical impossibility, a heavy, rhythmic thud that should have required a weight of several tons. Yet he moved with the silence of a shadow across water. He took a seat. The stool, a chrome and vinyl construction, designed to support up to 350 pounds, groaned. The molecular bonds of its frame screamed. The ogre's weight was not merely physical. It was the gravitational pull of a history written in the blood of kings. Coke. The syllable was a low-frequency vibration that rattled the glassware behind the counter. It wasn't a request. It was a decree that the atmosphere itself had to carry to the ears of the bartender. The man behind the wood was a veteran of the New York nightlife, a man who had seen soups tip over cars and fly through buildings. But as he looked into Yujiro's eyes, dark pits of ancient, predatory intelligence, the bartender's autonomic nervous system took over. The smooth muscle of his bladder wall, the detrusor, underwent a sudden, involuntary contraction. A warm, shameful dampness bloomed across his denim jeans. The smell of ammonia and fear filled the small radius between them. The bartender didn't move. He couldn't. His motor cortex had been hijacked by a primal command, inherited from ancestors who watched their kin get torn apart by saber-toothed cats. To move was to be noticed. To be noticed was to cease. Yujiro didn't look down at the man's legs. He didn't have to. The ogre's olfactory senses, honed by decades of tracking wounded prey through the Siberian taiga, had already cataloged the scent of the man's cowardice. He simply stared at his own reflection in the back bar mirror, a reflection that showed the demon back rippling beneath his shirt, a face of pure, distilled violence that found this world's superheroes to be nothing more than bloated, colorful livestock. He waited for his drink. The silence in the bar was so absolute that the hum of the refrigerator sounded like a jet engine. No one breathed. To inhale was to steal the ogre's air, and in this room, only one man was permitted the luxury of life. Ballistic psychologists have long maintained that the human mind requires a buffer of disbelief to process a threat, a period of 0.8 seconds, where the brain attempts to categorize a predator before the nervous system triggers a response. In the presence of the ogre, that buffer does not exist. The brain does not categorize, it recognizes an ancestral debt. As the digital feed from the rusty nail bar bypassed Vought's encryption and bled into the private monitors of the world's most powerful architects, the atmosphere in three distinct locations underwent a localized solidification. In the sterile, mahogany-scented silence of his penthouse, Stan Edgar adjusted his glasses. He did not see a soupy. His clinical mind, trained to view the world as a series of managed assets, hit a structural wall. He observed the way the light died in the proximity of the man's traps and lats, a biological density that defied the pharmaceutical logic of the last 80 years. To Edgar, YUJIRO was a black swan event, a variable that could not be bought, branded, or lobbied. If a man could achieve the apex of power through the mere refinement of his own cellular mitochondria, the billion-dollar industry of compound V became a redundant toy. This variable must be deleted, Across the city, in the Seven Tower, Homelander stood frozen before a wall of monitors. His super hearing was currently struggling to process the sound of Yujiro's pulse. It wasn't the frantic thrum of a frightened animal. It wasn't the synthetic hum of a V-enhanced heart. It was a heavy, tectonic beat, one stroke every 2 seconds. It sounded like a drum made of human skin. For the first time since his birth in a sterile lab, the Golden God felt a chill in his DNA. He saw a man who didn't need a cape to fly, because the earth itself seemed to recoil from his footsteps. He isn't one of mine. If he breathes, I am just a brand. He must die, so that I remain the only son. Meanwhile, in a basement reeking of stale gunpowder and unwashed rage, Billy Butcher stared at the grainy footage. He didn't see a corporate mascot or a hero. He saw the ultimate cunt. But unlike the others, Butcher recognized the scent of the ogre. It was the scent of a struggle that transcended politics and pharmaceuticals. It was the raw, unadulterated weight of a man who had turned his own body into a temple of genocide. Butcher felt the phantom ache of his own losses, the crushing weight of a world that took everything from the small. You're the end of the road, ain't you? You have to go, mate. Not for Vought, but because as long as you're standing, the rest of us are just ants waiting for a boot. 3 philosophies, 3 divergent histories, and 3 warring spirits converged on a single, silent conclusion. The ogre was an ontological insult. He was a singular point of absolute perfection in a world that survived on the necessity of the imperfect, the machine, the god, and the ghost. All came to the same realization: the light of the Hanma must be extinguished. Bioacousticians have long noted that a true vacuum does not exist in nature. Sound always finds a medium. However, they have failed to study the Hanma null. When the ogre finished the last of his glass, the liquid carbonation having been flattened instantly by the sheer kinetic pressure of his grip, the ambient noise of Manhattan did not just fade, it was edited out of reality. Yujiro set the glass down. The sound of the hollow vessel meeting the wood was not a clink. It was a definitive, low-frequency thud. It signaled the end of a grace period. He rose. The bar stool, finally released from the burden of his impossible density, groaned as its metal frame attempted to spring back into its original molecular alignment. It failed. The steel had been permanently tamed by his posture. He walked toward the exit, his silhouette bisecting the dim light of the bar, like a shutter closing on a dying world. As he stepped onto the sidewalk of 7th Avenue, the city of 8 million people had become a tomb of yellow cabs and frozen pedestrians. The typical roar of the city that never sleeps had been replaced by a silence so heavy it felt like a physical weight on the eardrums of those watching from the rooftops. Yujiro stopped. He did not look left or right. He didn't need to. Modern radar systems rely on the bouncing of radio waves to detect an incoming threat. The Hanma nervous system, however, utilizes a sensory array that predates the invention of the wheel. By perceiving the ionic disturbance caused by the intent to kill, Yujiro Hanma does not see his enemies. He feels the specific gravity of their malice. To him, the hidden snipers on the surrounding skyscrapers aren't shadows. They are glowing heat signatures of fluttering hearts and sweating palms. He leaned back, his spine popping with a sound like a string of firecrackers. He could feel them now. To his left, the high-frequency hum of a pressurized suit. Black Noir, hovering in the liminal space of an alleyway, his breath a shallow, mechanical rasp. Above him, the ionized scent of ozone and burnt sugar. Homelander, hovering 300 feet up, his cape snapping in a wind that Yujiro refused to acknowledge. And in the distance, the jagged, arrhythmic heartbeat of a man, fueled by pure, unrefined spite. Butcher, his finger twitching against a detonator, a smirk, slow and jagged as a mountain range, split the ogre's face. Is this the best this era has to offer? The words weren't whispered. They were projected with a diaphragm strength that caused the windows of the nearby Seiko shop to vibrate at their resonant frequency. He was waiting. He wasn't waiting for an opening or a diplomatic envoy. He was waiting for the first one to be brave enough to commit the error of attacking him. He stood in the center of the intersection, his arms hanging loosely at his sides, his chest expanding with a slow, terrifying rhythm of a bellows. He had offered them the first move, a tactical gift born of absolute, crushing boredom. The air around his fists began to shimmer, not from heat, but from the microscopic vibration of his muscle fibers, warming up to 110 degrees. He was a biological engine, idling at 1,000,000 horsepower, waiting for the light to turn red. Black Noir did not descend. He vanished from the roofline and reappeared in the ogre's blind spot as a blurred streak of tactical obsidian. He moved with the silence of a shadow, a silence engineered in a lab to bypass even the most sensitive sonar. His twin katanas, composed of a proprietary tungsten carbon weave, swept through the air in a horizontal pincer movement. It was designed to bisect a man at the waist before the brain could register the glint of steel. The blades never reached the fabric of Yujiro's garb. In a movement that defied the physics of momentum, Yujiro's torso didn't turn. It vibrated, a 3-inch shift in his footing, executed in roughly 0.002 seconds, moved his center of mass, just enough to render the strike mathematically impossible. The blades whistled through the space, where his spine had been a millisecond prior. Yujiro's hand shot out. It wasn't a punch. It was a casual snatch, as if plucking a fly from the air. His fingers closed around the flat of Noir's lead blade. The sound that followed was the crystalline fracture of metal exceeding its structural load-bearing limit. The tungsten snapped, like a dry twig. Noir didn't hesitate. He dropped the hilt and pivoted, driving a knee reinforced with compound 5 hardened bone toward Yujiro's solar plexus. The impact generated a shockwave that displaced the surrounding air in a visible ring of dust, a force equivalent to a head-on collision with a freight train. Yujiro didn't flinch. He didn't even breathe. He took the strike flush. His external obliques tightened into a density that mimicked a solid slab of depleted uranium. The kinetic energy did not travel through his body. It reflected. Noir's own patella shattered upon contact with the ogre's muscle. The sound of splintering bone was muffled by the black fabric of his suit. "Is that it?" His voice was a low, guttural rasp. He reached out and gripped Noir's mask. The reinforced Kevlar weave groaned under the pressure of the ogre's thumb. With a flick of his wrist, Yujiro didn't throw the assassin. He accelerated him. Noir was launched backward. His body broke the sound barrier for a brief, screaming instant before he slammed through the brick facade of a department store. The building didn't just shake. The structural steel beams groaned as 400 kilopascals of force were transferred into the foundation. A cloud of pulverized brick and glass erupted outward. Yujiro stood in the center of the intersection, his hands returned to his pockets. He hadn't even uncrossed his feet. He looked up at the sky, his eyes locked onto the golden figure hovering above. He beckoned with a single, mocking finger. Homelander did not descend with the grace of a savior. He dropped like a kinetic bombardment. The air ignited around his frame. A sonic boom shattered the remaining windows of the Seiko shop as he transitioned from a hover to a terminal velocity strike. He didn't use his fists. He led with his shoulder. He intended to smear the red-haired anomaly across the asphalt, like a grease stain. The impact was a cataclysm of physics. The ground beneath Yujiro's feet didn't just crack, it liquefied. A crater 10 meters wide erupted instantly. The asphalt turned to fine powder, and then to a searing plasma under the sheer friction of the collision. The displacement of 600 kilopascals of pressure sent a shock wave through the sewer lines. It caused manhole covers 3 blocks away to launch into the air like iron frisbees. When the dust settled, the God of America was not standing over a corpse. YUJIRO HANMA was holding Homelander's shoulder, not with a grapple, but with a single, hooked palm that had caught the unstoppable momentum and grounded it into the earth. The ogre's legs were buried mid-calf in the pulverized street. His muscles bulged with such intensity that the fabric of his trousers shredded, revealing thighs that looked like knotted steel cables. Homelander's eyes glowed a violent, searing red. At point-blank range, 2 beams of concentrated thermal energy, hotter than the surface of the sun, lanced out toward Yujiro's face. Yujiro didn't blink. He tilted his head by exactly 1.4 degrees. The heat vision grazed his cheek, cauterizing the air, and melting a hole through the marble facade of the bank behind him. But it missed the mark. Before Homelander could adjust his sweep, Yujiro's other hand moved. It was a Nukite spear hand strike, a thrust executed with such velocity that the air in front of his fingertips compressed into a solid wall of nitrogen. The strike didn't hit Homelander's chest. It hit the precise junction of the clavicle and the sternum. The invulnerable suit of the Seven's leader tore like wet paper. The sound was not a punch. It was a metallic ping, the sound of a diamond-tipped drill hitting a reinforced vault. Homelander's breath left him in a ragged, bloody spray. His internal organs, shielded by layers of V-hardened tissue, underwent a massive sympathetic vibration that caused his heart to skip 3 beats. Yujiro leaned in. His face was inches from the blond man's terrified mask. The ogre's skin was hot to the touch, radiating a caloric burn that rivaled the soup's own heat vision. "You've been pampered," the voice rumbled. "The world told you that you were a storm, but you've never even felt a breeze." With a sudden, violent torque of his hips, Yujiro drove his head forward. A headbutt. The collision of their skulls sounded like 2 tectonic plates grinding together. The force didn't just stun Homelander, it sent him skipping across the crater floor. His cape tangled in the debris. The ogre stepped out of the hole. His bronze skin was steaming in the cool New York night. A high-frequency whine, pitched at a level that would liquefy the inner ear of a standard canine, sliced through the sulfurous air of the crater. Frenchie, perched in the scorched skeleton of a newsstand, twisted the dial on a repurposed Vought ultrasonic emitter. The air began to ripple in visible, serrated waves, oscillating at 40,000 hertz. Yujiro's ear canal didn't bleed. Instead, The stapedius muscle in his middle ear contracted with the precision of a hydraulic press, dampening the vibration before it could touch his brain. He didn't even turn his head. Now! Butcher's voice barked over a closed comms channel. From the black maw of a subway entrance, Mother's Milk ignited a specialized M2 flamethrower. This wasn't standard napalm. It was a white phosphorus cocktail laced with a zinc-based suppressant designed to coat a soup's skin and block their pores, inducing immediate heat stroke. A torrent of blinding chemical fire engulfed the ogre, turning the center of the intersection into a furnace. Within the white-hot inferno, Yujiro's silhouette remained vertical. He didn't move to extinguish the flames. His skin, a landscape of hyper-dense keratin and collagen, simply radiated a caloric output so intense it created a thermal barrier. The phosphorus didn't stick. It slid off his sweat-slick shoulders, as if he were coated in mercury. A blur of gray and black tore through the fire. Kimiko, she didn't approach with a stance. She moved like a cornered animal, her fingers hooked into claws. She vaulted off Yujiro's pectoral, her nails capable of shredding reinforced aluminum, digging for his eyes. Yujiro's hand moved. It wasn't a strike. It was a capture. He caught Kimiko by the throat mid-air. The kinetic energy of her leap was swallowed by his arm, which didn't so much as tremble. He held her aloft, her feet kicking uselessly against his chest. He looked into her eyes filled with the jagged memories of a childhood spent in a cage, the scars of a laboratory life written in her frantic pupils. "You have the hunger of a wolf," Yujiro murmured, the heat of the fire making his crimson hair dance like a living flame. "But you have the leash of a dog." He didn't crush her windpipe. Instead, he flicked his wrist, sending her skipping across the asphalt toward a pile of rubble. A heavy thump crack echoed from a rooftop. Butcher! He wasn't using a crowbar. He was braced behind a .50 caliber Barrett sniper rifle, loaded with depleted uranium rounds, the kind used to punch through tank armor. The round struck Yujiro's shoulder blade at 2,800 feet per second. The projectile didn't penetrate, it flattened. The sound of the impact was like a sledgehammer hitting an anvil. Yujiro's shirt tore away completely, revealing the demon back. The muscles of his posterior torso shifted. The latissimus dorsi and teres major knotted into a grotesque, weeping face of a titan. The bullet fell to the ground, a distorted coin of lead and uranium. Yujiro slowly turned his head to look at the rooftop where Butcher sat. The ogre's smile wasn't one of malice. It was one of recognition. He saw the resolve in the man on the roof, the determination of a creature that knew it was outmatched, but refused to look away. It was a spirit forged in the soot of London and the ash of a broken life. Yujiro took a step, then another. He wasn't running. He was walking through the chemical fire, the white phosphorus turning to gray ash under his feet. He was the only thing in the city that felt real. The sidewalk didn't just break under Yujiro's launch. It disintegrated into a pressurized cloud of grit. The ogre didn't use the fire escape. He ignored the architectural pathways of lesser men. He drove his fingers into the brickwork of the facade. The masonry yielded, like wet clay. With a single, explosive contraction of his calves, he propelled his biological mass 40 feet upward in a blur of crimson and bronze. On the roof, Billy Butcher didn't blink. He felt the vibration through his boots, a rhythmic, violent, pulsing that traveled up the steel skeleton of the building. He dropped the empty Barrett. The heavy rifle clattered against the gravel. He reached into his coat and pulled a crowbar. The cold iron was a familiar weight against his palm. Yujiro crested the ledge. He didn't pull himself up. He arrived. The momentum of his final bound carried him over the parapet. His feet struck the gravel with a sound like a depth charge. The roof deck buckled. Several support joists beneath the tar paper snapped under the sudden, localized, increase in gravity. The ogre stood tall. The muscles of his posterior torso still rippled in the moonlight, the weeping face on his back, seemingly staring Butcher down. The chemical fire from the street below had left Yujiro's skin shimmering with a faint, iridescent sheen of ash and sweat. "You're not a bird," Yujiro's voice cut through the wind. "You're a scavenger. You wait for the predators to tire so you can pick at the remains." Butcher spat blood onto the gravel. His eyes weren't filled with wide-eyed terror or narcissistic fragility. They were hollow, dark pits, containing decades of unvented rage and the cold ash of everything he had once cherished. "Scavenger? Maybe," Butcher growled, stepping forward into the ogre's shadow. "But I've spent my whole life finding out that even predators bleed. And you're just a bigger beast looking for a new jungle to ruin." Yujiro's hand moved. It wasn't a strike. He reached out and gripped the end of Butcher's crowbar. The iron didn't just bend, it warped. The molecular structure of the metal was forced into a spiral. As Yujiro twisted his wrist with casual indifference, Butcher held on. His muscles strained until the tendons in his forearms threatened to snap. He refused to let go of the only tool he had left. The ogre looked into Butcher's eyes. He saw the jagged map of a broken spirit. He didn't see a hero. He saw a man who had decided that since his world was gone, he would burn the rest of it down to keep warm. "A man who has lost everything," Yujiro noted. His grip tightened until the crowbar began to hum with tension. "That is the only thing in this city that doesn't smell like a laboratory." With a violent shove, Yujiro didn't just push the man back. He displaced the air between them. Butcher was sent skidding across the roof, his heels digging grooves into the tar. He hit the mechanical penthouse with a bone-jarring thud. The iron bar, now a twisted knot of useless metal, fell to the gravel. Yujiro didn't follow. He turned his gaze toward the horizon, where the lights of Vought Tower loomed, like a neon tombstone. The real hunt hadn't even begun. In the hyper-sterile silence of the Vought control room, the air conditioning hummed at a constant 68 degrees. Stan Edgar did not look at the carnage in Times Square. He looked at the mechanics of it. On a 70-inch crystalline display, the footage of Yujiro Hanma crushing a tungsten blade was looped, slowed to 10,000 frames per second. Edgar's thumb traced the edge of his tablet. He wasn't looking for a weakness in the skin. He was looking for a weakness in the logic. Homelander was a blunt instrument, a chemical anomaly that functioned through the sheer arrogance of invulnerability. But this creature, this red-haired ghost, functioned through the obsessive refinement of every tendon, every synaptic firing, and every drop of ancestral sweat. He didn't just have strength, he had technique. "He is a purist," Edgar whispered to the empty room. "A collector of combat, a man who views the world not as a society, but as a biological hierarchy." The CEO's mind, a supercomputer of corporate survival, shifted gears. You cannot trap a hurricane with a cage, but you can lead it into a valley where it will exhaust itself. If Yujiro Hanma was a seeker of the strongest, then Vought would provide the ultimate stage, a curated bloodbath, a grand tournament under the guise of a Vought-sponsored martial arts exhibition. It would be a siren song for a man who defined himself by the struggle. And in the center of that stage, amidst the cheers of a bought and paid for audience, Edgar would apply the surgical solution. Not a hammer, but a scalpel. He tapped his comms link, bypassing the encrypted channels of the Seven. On the rooftop, 3 blocks away, a small black receiver in Billy Butcher's tactical vest chirped. Butcher, still reeling from the ogre's shove, spat a mouthful of copper-tasting bile and pressed the device to his ear. Butcher. Edgar's voice came through, cold and devoid of static. Stop trying to kill him with lead. You're attempting to prune a forest with a pair of scissors. He isn't a soupy. He's a devotee, and he's bored. Butcher looked at Yujiro's back, the demon muscles still pulsing with a terrifying, rhythmic life. The hell do you want, Edgar? Another movie deal? I want a containment field he won't want to leave. Edgar replied, he wants a challenge. We give him a bracket. Every V-enhanced freak we have, every underground pit fighter, and every laboratory monster we've been hiding in the woods. We lure him to the Vought Arena. While he's occupied with the spectacle of his own obsession, we'll introduce a localized, gaseous variant of the suppressant. We won't kill him with a bullet. Billy will kill him with the weight of his own biology. Butcher's eyes narrowed. A dark, jagged grin spread across his face. A tournament, eh? The ogre in a cage with the rest of the animals. I like the sound of that. Mate. Yujiro's head tilted slightly. He didn't turn around, but his ears twitched. He had heard the transmission. He didn't care about the trap. He only cared about the promise of the bracket. Sociologists often argue that the modern human has been domesticated by the comfort of the screen, the predictability of the grocery store, and the safety of the law. They are fundamentally deluded. Deep within the amygdala, buried under layers of social conditioning and corporate branding, lies a dormant, jagged appetite for the absolute. The masses do not seek peace. They yearn to witness the exact moment a mountain collapses under the weight of its own gravity. In the hours following the Manhattan tremor, Vought International's PR machinery didn't attempt to bury the footage. You cannot hide a supernova with a blanket. Instead, they weaponized the collective terror. They converted the sheer kinetic displacement, measured at 400 kilopascals at the epicenter, into a marketable frenzy. Within 90 minutes, every digital billboard from Times Square to Tokyo transitioned from perfume ads to a stark, high-contrast image of the ogre's silhouette. The caption was a masterpiece of manipulative doctrine. The apex challenge. Are our gods truly unstoppable? The public reaction was a psychological wildfire. For years, the common man had outsourced his own tenacity to corporate icons and spandex. Now, seeing a man who bled without a blue vial, a man who looked like an anatomical drawing brought to life by a vengeful creator, it sparked a primal thirst, a subterranean longing for autonomy, began to bubble through the cracks of the city. People weren't just watching a fight, they were looking for a reason to believe that the human frame, through sheer, unadulterated fortitude, could still claim the throne. Biologists observe that certain migratory predators travel thousands of miles of barren wasteland to reach a specific coordinate. They do not do this for the climate. They do this because they sense a density of life. To YUJIRO HANMA, the Vought Arena is not a trap. It is a watering hole where the synthetic has reached its highest concentration. He does not see a tournament bracket. He sees a menu. He is not being lured. He is being invited to a feast, where the guest of honor is also the executioner. Evolution has dictated that the chemical shortcut must eventually face the biological absolute. Yujiro walked down Broadway. The street was a ghost town, save for the flickering lights of abandoned stores. He didn't need a map to find the arena. He could feel the specific atmospheric distortion of the building, a structure designed to contain the uncontainable. Utilizing reinforced carbon steel alloys with a tensile strength exceeding 800 megapascals, he could smell the scars of the city, the deep-seated origins of a world built on the shortcut of chemistry, and he found it profoundly lacking. He stopped in front of a shattered window. His own reflection stared back at him, the demon back having settled into a low, menacing thrum of potential energy. His core temperature hovering at a stable 110 degrees, despite the cool night air. He wasn't thinking about Edgar's containment. He wasn't thinking about the resolve of the man on the roof. He was thinking about the lineage of combat, about the thousands of years of evolution it took to produce a fist that could shatter the very creed of a civilization. Every fiber of his 600-plus muscles was vibrating at a frequency that made the nearby glass hum in sympathetic resonance. High above, a Vought drone hovered, its lens zooming in on the ogre's face. Yujiro looked directly into the camera. He didn't snarl. He didn't gesture. He simply exhaled, a slow, hot gust of air that fogged the lens from 60 feet away. His reaction time was calculated at a mere 0.0001 seconds. As he tracked the drone's orbital path, the hunt was no longer a secret. The grand tournament had its first entrant, and for the first time in the recorded legacy of the Vought era, the gods were the ones praying to a force they couldn't synthesize in a lab. The shattered memories of a weaker world were being rewritten in real time by the footsteps of a monster who refused to acknowledge their rules. The Vought Arena was not merely a stadium, it was a $5 billion architectural prayer to the god of optics. Constructed with over 200,000 tons of reinforced hyperconcrete and lined with electromagnetic dampeners, it was designed to withstand the tantrum of a god. 100,000 spectators sat in tiers of gold-leaf plastic, their collective longing for violence vibrating through the very foundation. This was the modern Colosseum, where the synthetic and the biological would finally collide in a curated bloodbath. Beneath the blinding stadium lights, the air tasted of ozone and expensive cologne. Then, the water arrived. A massive hydraulic lift rose from the center of the ring. It carried a glass-walled tank holding 50,000 gallons of seawater. In the center stood Kevin Moskowitz, known to the world as the Deep. Oceanographers often marvel at the resilience of the deep-sea fish that thrives at depths of 8,000 meters. At such depths, the hydrostatic pressure is approximately 80 megapascals, or 800 times the atmospheric pressure at sea level. For a human to exist in this environment, their skeletal lattice and cellular walls must be forged in a crucible of absolute density. The Deep is not merely a man who swims. He is a biological vault. His ribs are composed of a hypercalcified matrix that treats a sledgehammer strike like a gentle breeze. In the water, he is the undisputed master of the crush. The Deep stepped out of the tank, his suit shimmering like the scales of a predatory shark. He felt the weight of the 100,000 eyes on him. He felt the tenacity of his own legend. He looked across the ring at the ogre, who stood as a still, bronzed monolith. "You're in my world now, freak," the deep sneered. His lungs, capable of extracting oxygen from the most stagnant brine, expanded with arrogant fortitude. He launched forward, his movement assisted by a localized burst of aquatic kinetic energy. He didn't throw a punch. He threw a collision of the deep-sea trenches. YUJIRO HANMA did not move his feet. He did not raise a guard. As the deep's fist, a strike with a calculated impact force of 15,000 newtons, approached his jaw. Yujiro reached out with a thumb and forefinger. He didn't catch the fist. He caught the deep's tra-cha. The sound that followed was not a strike. It was the wet, horrific crunch of a biological vault being breached. The ogre's grip strength, fueled by a legacy of crushing coal into diamonds, bypassed the Supi's hyper-dense bone structure. The deep's gills, located on the sides of his torso, suddenly flared in a frantic, bloody spasm. "The pressure of the ocean is a passive force," Yujiro whispered, his voice audible even over the roar of the crowd. "It is a weight that waits, but a warrior's grip, that is a weight that demands." Yujiro applied a rotational torque to the deep's neck. The soup's internal pressure, the very thing that allowed him to survive the Mariana Trench, turned against him. Without the external resistance of the sea, the ogre's squeeze caused the deep's internal organs to undergo a catastrophic decompression. In a visceral explosion of anatomical failure, the deep's eyes were forced from their sockets by the sheer internal PSI. His ribs, those hypercalcified marvels, buckled inward, puncturing his lungs in a rhythmic, jagged symphony of bone. The Lord of the Seven fell to his knees, not in submission, but because his nervous system had been liquidated. Yujiro didn't stop. He placed a single foot on the deep's chest and pulled. The sound was like a heavy oak tree being split by lightning. The ogre tore the king of the sea in two. The biological creed of the Hanma bloodline proved that the deepest ocean was nothing more than a shallow puddle compared to the depths of true martial obsession. The stadium went silent. The 100,000 spectators didn't scream. They breathed in the metallic scent of aerosolized blood. The god was dead. The apex had merely finished his appetizer. Yujiro tossed the remains toward the Seven's VIP box, where Homelander sat, his face a mask of pale, twitching fury. The ogre looked at the massive digital bracket hovering over the arena. The name, the deep, flickered and turned gray. "Next!" the voice rumbled. His muscles expanded as the demon back began to glow. With the heat of a stoked furnace, across the arena, the heavy steel doors of the Challenger Gate began to groan. A shadow emerged, a massive, hulking shape, from the deepest vaults of Vought's shattered memories. The tournament had truly begun. The heavy iron doors of the Challenger Gate didn't open. They were kicked aside by a frantic, blue-streaked blur. A-Train skidded into the center of the arena. The friction of his specialized boots melted the top layer of the hyper-concrete. He stood there, vibrating, a localized earthquake of flesh and compound 5. Inside A-Train's chest, his heart was a drum, being played by a lunatic. His pulse had surged past 200 beats per minute, a frantic, staccato rhythm that echoed in his own ears like a countdown. He looked at the floor, at the red-tinged smear that used to be the deep. His stomach did a slow, sickening roll. The air in the stadium felt different, thick, heavy, and saturated with the scent of old leather. and drying blood. YUJIRO HANMA hadn't moved since the dismemberment. He stood amidst the carnage, with his hands shoved deep into his pockets. His chin was tilted up toward the rafters. He wasn't even looking at the speedster. "You're shaking." The voice didn't carry across the arena. It seemed to resonate from the ground up, vibrating in the marrow of A-Train's shins. "I'm warmed up," A-Train shouted, his voice cracking. He reached for his belt, surreptitiously checking the remaining vials of V. He needed more. He needed to be faster than logic. He needed to be a ghost. A-Train vanished. To the audience, he became a translucent ribbon of blue light, circling the perimeter of the ring at 343 meters per second. The sonic booms were a series of sharp, rhythmic cracks. They sounded like a firing squad. He was a hurricane of kinetic potential, building momentum for a strike that should, by all laws of physics, liquefy any target it touched. YUJIRO closed his eyes. In the center of that blue storm, the ogre was a pillar of absolute stillness. He didn't track the light with his eyes. He felt the atmospheric displacement against his skin. Every time A-Train passed, a wall of compressed air hit YUJIRO's frame. To the ogre, the speedster wasn't a god of velocity. He was a fly buzzing in a room, his flight path dictated by a desperate chemical panic. A-Train saw the opening, or what he thought was an opening. YUJIRO's neck was exposed, his posture relaxed. A-Train pivoted, his heel carving a 3-inch groove into the concrete, as he redirected his mass toward YUJIRO's carotid artery. The collision was supposed to be the end of the match. A-Train's fist, traveling at Mach 1.2, carried a kinetic energy of 4.7 million joules. YUJIRO's hand moved. It wasn't a punch. It was a slap. A casual, backhanded flick of the wrist, executed in the microscopic window of time between A-Train's intent and his arrival. The impact sounded like a car being crushed in a hydraulic press. The back of YUJIRO's hand caught A-Train flush in the face. The speedster's momentum didn't just stop, it reversed. His head snapped back with such violence that the V-hardened vertebrae in his neck audibly ground together. A-Train was sent spiraling across the arena, his body skipping across the floor like a flat stone on a pond. Each bounce sent fragments of his blue suit and shards of teeth flying into the air. He hit the reinforced base of the Sevens VIP box with a sickening thud. The structural steel buckled inward. He lay in a heap, his legs twitching in a rhythmic, mechanical spasm. The blue light in his eyes flickered and died, replaced by a dull, glazed, gray. He tried to breathe, but his lungs were filled with the metallic tang of his own pulverized sinuses. YUJIRO looked at his hand. He blew a single speck of blue fabric off his knuckles. "Speed is a luxury of the weak," YUJIRO rumbled, stepping toward the broken speedster. "A man who runs from his own shadow has already lost the battle of the spirit." He looked up at the VIP box, his gaze locking onto Homelander, who was now standing. His fist clenched so hard, the marble railing was beginning to dust. "Two down," YUJIRO said. "Send the rest, all of them. My hands are starting to get cold." YUJIRO HANMA looked down at the twitching wreckage of A-Train. The speedster's heart, a hyper-accelerated engine fueled by blue sludge, was sputtering like a dying lawnmower. With the casual indifference of a man extinguishing a cigarette, YUJIRO shifted his weight. He didn't stomp. He simply allowed his heel to descend onto the center of A-Train's chest. The reinforced sternum designed to survive max-speed collisions, surrendered with the sound of a dry branch snapping. The frantic drumming stopped. The silence of the arena became absolute. The steel gates groaned again. Three figures stepped into the red-stained dust of the ring. Queen Maeve walked in the center, her sword heavy at her hip, her eyes fixed on the ogre. To her left, Starlight moved with a trembling gait, her hands glowing with a soft, flickering luminescence that betrayed her terror. To their right, Stormfront hovered an inch off the ground, her face a mask of Aryan arrogance, purple arcs of electricity dancing between her fingertips. Maeve didn't look at the crowd. She didn't look at the cameras. She looked at the way Yujiro's muscles settled, the way his breath steamed in the cool air. She felt a cold, sharp realization pierce through her cynicism. We aren't here to win. We are the wall Vought is throwing at the tide to see how long it takes for us to wash away. She caught Annie's eye. Starlight's pupils were blown wide, her breathing shallow. "Annie," Maeve whispered, the sound lost under the hum of Stormfront's lightning, the exit behind the VIP box. "If I can hold him for 10 seconds, you run. You don't look back. You tell the world what Edgar did." Starlight swallowed hard, her light faltering. "Maeve, we can't." "Shut up and move," Stormfront hissed, her eyes glowing a feral violet. "I'm not dying in a cage with you two failures. I'm going to fry this untermensch and take his head to Edgar." Stormfront screamed, a jagged, high-voltage discharge erupted from her palms. The air ionized instantly. 1,000,000 volts of pure kinetic fury lancing toward Yujiro's chest. The ogre didn't dodge. He didn't even raise his arms. He stepped into the lightning. The electricity crawled over his skin, illuminating the hyper-dense network of his nervous system. But it didn't burn. His body, a biological conductor of unparalleled purity, grounded the energy through the soles of his feet and into the stadium's foundation. He walked through the violet storm as if it were a light summer rain. In the heartbeat of Stormfront's confusion, Yujiro was there. He moved through the space between them, not with speed, but with a predatory erasure of distance. He gripped Stormfront's face, his thumb and forefinger locking onto her jaw. "Your spark is loud," Yujiro rumbled, his grip tightening until her skull began to groan. "But your grip is hollow." He didn't use a strike, he used a tearing motion. With a single, explosive jerk of his deltoids, he ripped Stormfront's jaw from her head. The scream died in a spray of darkened, V-rich blood. He tossed her aside like a piece of faulty machinery. Maeve roared, her tenacity overriding her fear. She drew her blade and lunged, the carbon steel edge aiming for the gap in the ogre's ribs. It was a perfect strike, born of 2 decades of combat resolve. Yujiro caught the blade with his teeth. The sound of the metal shattering against his enamel was like a gunshot. Maeve's eyes went wide. Before she could recoil, Yujiro's palm struck her center mass. The force didn't just push her, it sent her internal organs into a state of structural collapse. Her armor crumpled inward, her lungs turning to a bloody slurry. Starlight let out a primal cry, her hands erupting in a blinding supernova flash of energy. It was a desperate, final fortitude, a blast intended to melt the ogre's retinas. Yujiro's eyes didn't close. He stared into the white-hot light, his pupils contracting to pinpricks. He stepped through the brilliance and caught Starlight by the temples. For a fraction of a second, he looked into her terrified, innocent face. The origins of a hero who had been sold a lie. He closed his hands. The sound was muffled by the roar of the crowd. It was a wet, heavy sound of a legacy being extinguished. Yujiro stood in the center of the ring, surrounded by the three broken goddesses of the Vought era. He was the only thing left standing. He turned his head toward the VIP box, where Homelander was now leaning over the railing, his face a twitching map of pure, unadulterated madness. The grand tournament had cleared the board. The ogre was still hungry. Anthropologists have long categorized the development of human civilization by its tools: stone, bronze, iron, and finally, the digital. They claim that the modern era is defined by the abstraction of conflict, where power is a series of pixels on a screen or a chemical compound in a vial. They are wrong. What the 100,000 souls in the Vought arena experienced was a forced regression, a violent, instantaneous homecoming to the era of the apex. In the stands, the silence was not a lack of sound. It was a physical displacement of oxygen. A middle-aged man in the third tier, a mid-level accountant who had spent 40 years adhering to the logic of spreadsheets, found himself standing. He wasn't cheering. He wasn't screaming. He was looking at his own hands, his fingers curling into a primitive, shaking grip. For the first time in his life, the creed of corporate safety, the belief that he was protected by heroes and laws, had dissolved. He felt a phantom heat in his blood, an ancestral longing to stand in the red dust of the arena. The world outside the stadium had become a cathedral of glowing screens. In Tokyo, London, and Detroit, the collective fortitude of the human race was undergoing a seismic realignment. On social media, the trending metrics for Vought International didn't just drop, they evaporated. The brand was a corpse. You cannot market a product to a populace that has just witnessed the literal dismemberment of its idols. If one were to measure the psychic output of a civilization, they would find that most humans live in a state of biological hibernation. They outsource their agency to icons. But when YUJIRO HANMA stood over the broken remains of the Seven, he didn't just kill 3 women and a speedster. He killed the illusion of the shortcut. He reminded the world that the only true resolve is that which is etched into the bone through decades of obsession. The V was a lie. The Hanma was the fundamental truth. Deep within the slums of Mumbai and the high-rises of Manhattan, the reaction was the same. A visceral, cold shiver of recognition. The people weren't mourning Starlight or Maeve. They were mourning their own comfort. They were looking at a man who had bypassed the evolutionary ladder. They realized, with a terrifying thirst, that they were all merely witnesses to a higher form of life. The scars of the city, the old riots, the forgotten wars, the legacy of human struggle seemed to pulse in time with the ogre's heartbeat. The grand tournament had shifted from a televised spectacle to a global realization. The gods were actors, the ogre was the director, and the play was reaching its final, bloody act. In the Vought control room, the technicians didn't even look at the data anymore. The stock market had effectively ceased to exist for the Seven. There was only the video feed, a high-definition window into the end of the world, as they knew it. The atmospheric density within the Vought arena had surpassed the limits of standard barometric measurement. The oxygen itself felt granular, a suspended cloud of pulverized concrete and aerosolized godflesh. High above this carnage, in the shadows of the rafters, the air smelled of ozone and high-grade chemical suppressants. Billy Butcher stood with a detonator gripped so tightly, his knuckles resembled jagged mountain peaks. Next to him, Stan Edgar adjusted his tie. His face was illuminated by the pale blue glow of a tablet, displaying a molecular breakdown of a gaseous nerve agent. "You're sure about this?" "Suit?" Butcher rasped, his eyes fixed on the red-haired monolith in the center of the ring. "If that mist doesn't drop him, we're just hand-delivering the world to a monster who doesn't even want to run it. The ogre operates on a biological frequency we have never encountered," Edgar replied. His voice was a flat, clinical drone. "But even a hurricane is subject to the laws of chemistry. We are not killing a man. We are suffusing the atmosphere with a doctrine his cells cannot ignore. Your team provides the distraction. My labs provide the end." As the ogre stood amidst the remains of the seven, the heavy blast doors of the northern sector didn't just open, they were vaporized. A concentrated burst of nuclear thermal energy left a glowing, molten frame. Two figures emerged. In the lead was a relic of a forgotten era, a man encased in a scarred, olive-drab tactical suit that smelled of 1944 tobacco and radioactive fallout. Soldier Boy didn't fly. He marched, each step carrying the rhythmic weight of a heavy tank. Beside him, Homelander descended from the rafters. His cape was shredded. His face was a twitching landscape of manic instability. The genetic origin and the laboratory successor stood side by side, a visual paradox of the Vought legacy. Biologists have long noted that when two alpha predators from the same lineage occupy the same territory, the result is usually immediate fratricide. However, there is a singular exception, the appearance of an extinction-level event. To these two, YUJIRO HANMA is not a rival. He is a biological indictment. He is the proof that their power, whether forged in a 1940s crucible or a modern Petri dish, is nothing more than a cheap, chemical mimicry of true ascendance. The fortitude of a Hanma is not granted, it is extracted from the marrow of the past. Soldier Boy spat a glob of darkened phlegm onto the red dust of the ring. He didn't look at the ogre first. He looked at the trembling, golden-haired man beside him. "Look at you," Soldier Boy rasped, his voice a gravel grinder of disappointment. "You're shaking like a virgin at a prom. I gave my blood so they could make this? A caped mascot who cries when he gets punched in the mouth?" Homelander's eyes flared a violent red, the heat distorting the air in front of his face. "Shut your mouth, you fossil. I'm the upgrade. I'm the one the world loves. You're just the mistake they kept in a box in Russia." "Yeah, well, the mistake is still standing." Soldier Boy adjusted his shield. His knuckles were white against the leather straps. He finally turned his gaze toward Yujiro. "And that thing over there? That's the real problem. He looks like he eats guys like you for breakfast and shits out capes. You want to prove you're my son? Don't laser him from the sky like a coward. Get in the mud and break his teeth." Homelander's jaw tightened. A vein throbbed in his temple, with a frequency of 140 hertz. "I'll do more than break them. I'm going to unmake him. But if you get in my way, Dad, I'll burn the shield right through your chest." "Duly noted, kid. Try not to piss yourself." Yujiro Hanma watched them. His arms were crossed, the demon back beginning to shift in a rhythmic, predatory sequence. He felt the radioactive heat from the elder. He felt the chemical instability of the younger. To him, they weren't father and son. They were two different vintages of the same spoiled wine. He uncrossed his arms. The air around his fists began to shimmer as the kinetic potential of his muscles prepared to engage. The thirst for a true challenge was finally being met by a tenacity born of shared hatred. "The stage is set," Yujiro rumbled, his voice dropping an octave. "Show me which version of the lie dies first." The red glow in Homelander's eyes flickered, a dying ember in a storm. He felt the heat behind his retinas, the urge to simply erase the ogre with a sweep of crimson light. "Don't you dare," Soldier Boy growled, his voice a low vibration beneath the ringing in the stadium. "Put the flashlights away. You want to be a man? You want to be my blood?" Then you feel the marrow crack. You feel his heart stop through your own skin. Anything else is just a coward's shortcut. Homelander's jaw worked, the muscle ticking with the precision of a metronome. He inhaled, a sharp, jagged pull of air that tasted of the Seven's blood. The red faded. He lowered his head, his hands curling into fists that had never known the resistance of a true peer. "Fine," Homelander whispered. "No lasers, just bone." Yujiro Hanma smiled. It wasn't the smile of a victor. It was the smile of a man who had finally found a poem worth reading. "The theater of the synthetic is closed," the ogre murmured. "The blood speaks now." The three moved simultaneously, a convergence of three distinct eras of violence. Soldier Boy led with the shield, the reinforced tungsten zinc alloy cutting a horizontal arc through the air. The velocity was calculated at 180 meters per second, a weight of metal carrying the kinetic energy of a falling skyscraper. Yujiro didn't retreat. He stepped into the radius of the strike, his palm meeting the center of the shield. The sound was a bell tolling for a dying city. The vibration didn't stop at the shield. It traveled through Soldier Boy's shoulder, through his spine, and into the earth. The ground beneath the WW2 legend shattered in a perfect geometric circle at the same millisecond. Homelander arrived from the flank. He didn't fly. He lunged, his body a golden spear. His fist struck Yujiro's ribs, a strike that would have turned a main battle tank into scrap metal. Yujiro didn't flinch. He absorbed the impact, his internal obliques and serratus muscles shifting like a tectonic plate adjusting to a tremor. The force was redirected, channeled through his frame and out through his opposite shoulder, where he delivered a short, rhythmic elbow to Homelander's temple. The golden god stumbled, the world spinning in a kaleidoscope of blue and red. He felt it, the unfamiliar, stinging burn of a reality that didn't love him back. "Again!" Soldier Boy roared. He dropped the shield and threw a haymaker that carried the radioactive stench of 1,000 ruined bunkers. The fight became a rhythmic percussion. Thud. Yujiro's forearm blocking the shield. Crack. Homelander's knee meeting Yujiro's thigh. Snap. The ogre's fingers catching Soldier Boy's wrist. The sound of ligaments screaming. Under a pressure of 500 megapascals, they were a whirlwind of bronze, olive, and gold. Soldier Boy fought with the grit of the trenches, a brutal, efficient slog of attrition. Homelander fought with the desperate, jagged frenzy of a child trying to prove his existence. And in the center, Yujiro moved with the fluid, terrifying grace of a predator that had evolved beyond the need for effort. He caught them both by the throats, the father in his left hand, the son in his right. For a heartbeat, the three of them were a statue of absolute, crushing stillness. "You are the result of 1,000 scientists," Yujiro whispered, his grip tightening until the V-hardened tracheas began to buckle. "But I am the result of 1,000 wars. Do you feel the difference?" Do you feel the weight of the years you didn't earn? Homelander looked at his father. Soldier Boy looked at his son. In that shared gaze, they didn't find love or redemption. They found the cold, hard truth that they were both just ghosts in a world that the ogre had already conquered. With a roar that shook the very rafters, Yujiro drove them both downward. The impact didn't just break the floor, it pulverized the primary support column of the arena's northern sector. The stadium began to scream. The billions watching through high-definition lenses didn't blink. The global feed, once a curated stream of heroic poses, had become a raw window into a biological slaughterhouse. For the first time in 80 years, the world saw the gods of Vought not as icons, but as terrified animals. They saw Homelander's spit-flecked chin. They saw Soldier Boy's trembling, radioactive fingers. The illusion of the super had been stripped away, leaving only the reality of the victim. In the center of the pit, YUJIRO HANMA stood as the axis of a dying world. He held the two pinnacles of the Vought bloodline by their throats. His grip was a localized singularity that ignored their 800 megapascal bone density. You've spent your lives being worshipped for what you were given, Yujiro rumbled, his voice cutting through the groaning of the stadium's structural steel. Now, you will die for what you failed to become. He released them. For a fraction of a second, the father and son felt the mercy of oxygen. It was a tactical deception. Yujiro's hands moved in a sequence that predated the written word, a 3,000-year-old Chinese technique of internal vibration, known as the heaven-shaking palm. He didn't use a closed fist. He struck both men simultaneously in the center of their diaphragms with the flat of his palms. The kinetic energy was not absorbed by the skin. It was modulated to match the resonant frequency of their internal organs. The harmonic oscillation traveled through their V-saturated cells. Inside Homelander, the heart simply disintegrated into a fine, crimson mist. Inside Soldier Boy, the radioactive core in his chest cavity underwent a sudden, catastrophic containment failure. There was no outward bruise. There was only the sound of two lives being erased from the inside out. The gods slumped into the dust, their eyes rolling back into their head as their nervous systems surrendered to a logic older than their labs. Now! Stan Edgar's voice crackled in Butcher's ear. Butcher didn't hesitate. He slammed his thumb onto the detonator. High in the rafters, 300 canisters of a specialized aerosolized suppressant ruptured. A thick, emerald-hued mist descended into the crater. The gas was designed to bind to the mitochondria of a soupy, inducing immediate cellular paralysis. At that exact moment, the primary support joist of the northern sector gave way, a 500-ton steel girder. The stadium roof began to fold in on itself, a tectonic collapse of glass and iron that screamed like a dying beast. Butcher didn't run. He watched through the green haze as the rubble buried the remains of the seven. He watched the ogre disappear beneath a mountain of hyperconcrete. That's it then, Butcher muttered, his lungs burning from the stray wisps of the gas. The world's back to the humans. The silence that followed the collapse was heavy, suffocating. It reeked of pulverized stone and chemical rot. The green mist swirled over the mounds of debris, settling into the cracks. Then, the rubble moved. A slab of reinforced concrete, weighing approximately 12,000 kilograms, was tossed aside like a piece of cardboard. Yujiro Hanma stepped out of the dust. His skin was stained with the emerald gas. His breathing was deep and rhythmic. The suppressant, designed to shut down the V gene, had found nothing to bind to in his marrow. His biology was an island of purity in a sea of synthetic failure. He looked up through the settling dust. He saw a lone figure standing at the edge of the crater. Billy Butcher had stripped off his tactical vest. He had dropped the crowbar. He stood there with his sleeves rolled up, his knuckles raw and scarred, his eyes burning with the same prehistoric fire that fueled the ogre. "You still standing?" "Then?" Butcher called out, his voice echoing in the hollowed-out shell of the arena. "No more capes, no more chemicals. Just a man who hates you, and a monster who doesn't care." Yujiro stepped forward, the demon back on his torso, shifting into a mask of pure, unadulterated joy. He didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't prepare a technique. He simply raised his hands, his fingers curling into the most basic tool of human history, the fist. "A man who fights because he must," Yujiro said, his feet crunching on the shattered remains of the Vought logo. "That is the only poem I have ever truly loved." The ogre and the butcher closed the distance. There was no light, no lightning, and no cameras, just the sound of bone meeting bone. In the dark, the silence that followed the collapse of the Vought arena was not merely the absence of sound, it was the expiration of an entire era. In the wake of the New York incursion, the collective psyche of the human race underwent a violent, structural recalibration. The world had seen the peak, and the peak was not for sale. Within 48 hours of the Seven's extinction, the United Nations Security Council issued the Biological Sovereignty Act. Vought International was not merely sued, it was erased. The Compound 5 stocks were seized and incinerated. An international ban was placed on pharmaceutical mutagenics. Vought Tower was demolished, the land repurposed as a monument to biological purity. All hero films and merchandise were pulled from circulation, and Stan Edgar vanished. The realization that gripped the world's governments was one of pure, unadulterated terror. If a single man could dismantle a trillion-dollar army through the mere refinement of his own cellular mitochondria, then soups were not assets. They were liabilities. The era of the shortcut was declared dead. Across the globe, a new, jagged obsession took root. The gods had fallen, but the man remained. Gyms, dojos, and mountain retreats saw a 400% increase in attendance. The pharmaceutical industry collapsed, replaced by a fanatical, almost religious devotion to the philosophy of the frame. Humans stopped looking at the sky for saviors. They began looking at their own knuckles. The ogre had left behind a world that no longer believed in miracles. It believed in the terrifying, limitless potential of the human spirit. YUJIRO HANMA did not stay to accept a crown. He vanished into the smoke of the burning arena, leaving behind a vacuum that the world's intelligence agencies have failed to fill. Satellites search for a heat signature of 110 degrees moving across the landscape, but they find only ghosts. However, the reports keep coming in. The G-men in Ohio found pulverized from the inside out. The Tech Knight Foundation found with a 50-ton reinforced bunker door ripped from its hinges. The ogre is no longer an invader. He is a predator. In a world filled with high-grade, synthetic prey, he is roaming the planet, harvesting the strong to see if any of them can offer him a second poem. In a small, sun-drenched garden in the English countryside, a man sits with a glass of tea. There is no crowbar. There is no tactical vest. Billy Butcher's face is a map of scars, a permanent record of the night the ogre met the butcher. His hands, once constantly trembling, are now perfectly still. Mother's Milk, Frenchie, and Kimiko watch him from the porch of the cottage. A sense of profound alien peace hangs over the group. In their final exchange amidst the rubble, Yujiro hadn't just broken Butcher's ribs. He had struck the specific neurological nexus of Butcher's obsession. By meeting Butcher's pure human hatred with an even purer biological absolute, Yujiro had cleansed him. He had stolen Butcher's war. Because the war was no longer big enough to contain the man, Butcher looks at the horizon. The sun is setting over a world without capes. He doesn't feel the phantom itch of revenge. He doesn't feel the chemical burn of the V. The big bastard did it, Butcher murmurs, a small, genuine smile touching his lips. He killed the boys, and for the first time in 20 years, I think I'm all right with that. He takes a sip of his tea. The air is clear. The gods are dead. The ogre is out there, somewhere, hunting the last of the lies. And for the first time since his origins were written in ash, Billy Butcher is simply a man, deep in a subterranean vault. Stan Edgar watches a grainy, thermal feed of a man walking through the black forest. The man stops. He looks directly at the camera. The screen turns to static. Edgar closes his laptop. He reaches into his desk and pulls out a single, ancient book on 14th century martial arts. He begins to read. The transmission holds. Your unwavering focus, your absolute gaze, serves as the singular anchor point for these colliding realities. You didn't just watch, you stabilized the breach. Portal Comic X remains tethered to this plane only because you chose to endure the friction of the void until the very end. You are the battery. You are the witness. This channel is the only lens capable of capturing the collapse, and you are its pulse. Subscribe to the frequency now and step directly into the next anomaly. The portal is wide, and it is waiting.